whenever I meet with a deck of cards, lay my money down, lay my money down, lay my money down.
I didn't have any of the COVID vaccines, despite the fact it was compulsory in Peru. All Peruvians have an ID card, and their vaccine record was placed online. And the police didn't chase down people who didn't have an up-to-date vaccine record. What would happen is if you tried to get into your bank, there'd be a man stood on the door with a cell phone, tick, 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 put your ID number in, and if your vaccine record wasn't up to date, you didn't get in. You couldn't get to your own bank account. You couldn't fly domestically either in Peru. And I think there were a few other areas where basically life was made very difficult if you didn't have an up-to-date vaccine record. But none of that affected me. And the reason I didn't have the vaccine is because it had been developed in 2 months. And you can't develop a new vaccine so quickly, especially one that's intended for blanket rollout. Why? Because there's an immense amount of testing required to be done. You have to test it against every demographic. You have to test it against men and women. What about pregnant women? You've got to test it against the young and the old. The young, well, it's unlawful to test a vaccine on children. Why? Because they're below the age of consent to contract. You can't test vaccines on children. So children were never tested. And I knew all this, and this was a very frustrating time for me, because I was watching people queuing up around the block at the health centre in the baking sun, hand in hand with their children, waiting for their turn. And they were all primed with the propaganda coming out of the TV, the government propaganda, the TV, the radio, the newspapers. It was everywhere. Everyone was being told that the vaccine was very important, and nobody would listen to me. Found it a very difficult time for me. And when you're testing it, you've got to test people with pre-existing conditions. What about people with allergies? What about people with diabetes or asthma? People with obesity problems, people who are on existing medication. And because this was intended for a global rollout, what about people from different races? And there's a reason why different races look alike, and that's because they have a different genome. So it would have to be tested against people from the different races around the world as well. None of this was done. It was all rushed out. It was an absolute crime against humanity. That's what it was. It can't be. You can't put it any other way. It was a crime against humanity. 3 things with regards specifically with regards to the UK government, but it applies to all governments around the world. 3 things that you may or may not be aware of. The first one you surely will be aware of, and that's that the Prime Minister at the time of the lockdowns and the pandemic in the UK was Boris Johnson. And Boris Johnson was accused of holding cocktail parties in his official residence, number 10 Downing Street, during the lockdown period. Now, the outcry was such that eventually they had to call a parliamentary inquiry. They were going to look into this. Now, that parliamentary inquiry took 2 years. 2 years to reach its findings. 2 years. Why the hell it would take that long to find a few witnesses to say, yeah, there were parties in 10 Downing Street, or there wasn't? I have no idea. But in that 2-year period, Boris Johnson had not only resigned as Prime Minister, but he'd resigned as a Member of Parliament as well. So he wasn't even in Parliament anymore. And although the inquiry found that it was actually true, and that Boris Johnson and his cronies were actually flouting the lockdown laws that his government had imposed, has he been fined yet? Has he been imprisoned? You know, I'll leave you to work that one out. There were witnesses appeared at the inquiry, witnesses who had attended the parties, and they said that there was a man at the door of 10 Downing Street, such that when they were leaving, the man would say, oh, by the way, you really should leave one at a time. Don't leave in a group. And put your mask on before you leave. Yeah? Why? Because there might be photographers outside. That's why. Now, a lot of this is common knowledge, but did you know as well that the Labour Party in the UK was holding similar social gatherings as well, and so were the Liberal Democrats? That's the three major parties in the UK government, were all flouting the lockdown laws. Why? Because they knew the whole thing was bollocks. They knew that the lockdown measures were unnecessary. And this is at a time where if you had friends or relatives in hospital, you weren't allowed to visit them. You had to stay in your house 23 hours a day. If you had elderly relatives in a care home, you couldn't visit them. If you wanted to go and visit your mother, you could drive there in the car, drive to a house in the car, but you'd have to stand in the cold in the garden and have a conversation with her through a closed window while she stayed in the house. That was what the population of the UK was suffering due to the lockdown measures imposed by the government. That's the first thing. The second thing is, before the vaccine was rolled out, it was trialled. It was trialled in Switzerland. With a lot of people had trialled it. The outcome of the trial showed that there was a 2.5% chance that you may develop a fatal heart disease. There were a number of heart diseases you could have got after having the COVID vaccine. The main one was called myocarditis, and myocarditis deaths are off the scale now, ever since the vaccine was rolled out. 2.5% chance, and they knew that. They knew that from the results of the trial. The governments around the world, they knew that, and they went ahead with the vaccine rollout without informing anyone, without informing the public. Now, if you were stood in a queue waiting for your vaccine and somebody said to you, you've got your kids with you, yeah? Your kids are getting vaccinated as well. And somebody said to you, you do know that there's like a 1 in 40 chance that you might develop a fatal heart disease. Would you have stayed in the queue? They hid it. They hid it from the public, and they went ahead with the rollout anyway. We had a right to know the results of that trial. We had a right to know the risks involved. And there were more risks than heart disease, believe me. There were proper liver diseases. Liver diseases you could get. You could get problems with circulation, with blood clots. There were a lot of known problems came out of the trial in Switzerland, and it was all covered up and the rollout went ahead anyway. That's the second thing. The third thing as well is governments were also informed before the lockdowns that the lockdowns themselves would likely cause more problems than the COVID infection would. And lo and behold, during the lockdown period, people were suffering clinical depression. There were rises in suicide rates. Children in particular were suffering problems with emotional development, being locked in, not going to school, not being able to socialise. That's a fact. And people were also deficient in vitamin D. And how ironic that vitamin D is made by the skin when you're exposed to sun. But if you're locked in the house all day, you're not going to get any freaking sun. You're not going to get vitamin D. You're going to have a vitamin D deficiency. And vitamin D is highly important for boosting the immune system. And if there's a pandemic and a virus going around, what you want is a good immune system. There was vitamin D deficiency. Vitamin D deficiency in men leads to prostate cancer. That's the biggest killer in men, prostate cancer. And vitamin D deficiency is also strongly linked to dementia. Now, dementia, you go loopy. But what I didn't realise is dementia is actually a physical disease. The brain shrinks. The brain actually slowly shrinks until you lose intellectual capacity. That's what happens, and it's absolutely irreversible. Dementia, along with myocarditis, the dementia cases are through the roof now because of vitamin D deficiency. The governments knew the effects of the lockdown before they went ahead with it. So, I've only got one very simple question. before I go. That question is, do you trust your government?